Hello, everybody. Once again, welcome to Soundwave, where we are transforming and changing the world one voice at a time in our workplaces, in our communities, with our friends and families here. Welcome to Own Your Conversation. Now, this is a series that has been created, by both, Kevin and I, and together with a team. That's going to help you Soundwave Global coaches out there, and also for the Soundwave fans and enthusiasts, and for those folks who have done your Soundwave assessments. This is a series for everyone where you can learn everything about Soundwave, the strategies, the tips, the tricks of how to skillfully use our voice, target our talk, and be able to engage people around us. And as we say here around Soundwave, when we are able to initiate great conversations between people, we would be able to shift the dialogue, change the conversations, and shape the cultures and outcomes the way we want it. Hello, everybody. Once again, my name is Kim Pong, and I am the global partner of Soundwave. And together with me today is none other than Mr. Soundwave himself, who will be working together with me to be hosting this program. It is none other than Kevin Eyre, the creator of Soundwave. So good morning to Kevin. I believe you are in that little town called Bristol, or is it that little? I don't know. How are you doing?
Good morning, Lim Pong, and good morning, everybody who's listening. It's about 500,000 people, the population of Bristol, so it's a medium-sized city. It's more like a Dutch city, really, than an English city. English cities
Really?
tend to be big. Yeah.
What's the difference between a Dutch city and a English city? What's the difference there?
The Dutch tend to have cities which are around about 500,000 people. They tend to be smaller. Whereas we have cities of 4 or 5 million plus. Small in comparison to some other parts of the world, but in European terms reasonably large.
Wow. Well. I mean, where I am, I'm broadcasting here from Singapore, and where we are, I think we have 5+ million people right now in our city state here. So I think unlike Bristol, where you guys probably have very spread out, lots of space and all that, right? I mean, where we are here in Singapore, my goodness, we're gonna cram into this little what we call the island state. So yeah, it's not just our weather is warm, but our people are extremely warm simply because we are standing shoulder to shoulder to one another. Yeah, cool.
Well,
Well, it's first of all, my friend, it's so good to be able to be hosting this series together with you. I think for me, personal
Right.
great privilege, and I think, the last week when we actually ran the introduction for this series here, I learned a lot of new things that I never thought I would learn. But hey, guess what? I'm with the master of Soundwave here together, and just a great privilege, my friend. Uh, Now, everybody,
Thank
welcome to this Own Your Conversation series, and essentially it's a 10-episode series. We have done one in the introduction, so make sure you check us out on YouTube here. Today is the second episode of this 10-part series here, and we're going to be focusing on the topic of the verbal strategies. And today we are focusing on one verbal strategy, or what we call here in Soundwave the voice, and in this case here is the voice of inquiry. And I would like to start off with a very simple quote here. I think, Kevin, you probably know about this quote here, and this is from Abraham Lincoln, right? And he said something like, I must get to know, I'm so sorry, he said something, I don't like that man. I must get to know him better, right? I really love this quote because the first time when I heard it, I go like, my gosh, if I were Abraham Lincoln, if I don't like somebody, I wouldn't get to know him better. I'll run away from this guy, or just basically, kick him out from my room here. But this kind of segues us into really about the voice that we're going to be talking about, the voice of engagement, the voice of attention, the voice of inquiry here. So my first question to you, Kevin, is this, right? What do you think a world will look like, in the absence of inquiry?
That's a great question, and therefore a good example of inquiry. It would be closed, Kim Pong. It would be closed in the sense that the opposite to open. So we wouldn't explore, and we wouldn't connect anywhere as easily as we're able to do. And so I think it is a fundamental dimension of human beings and human interaction. There is a sort of quality, characteristic quality associated with inquiry, which is the quality of curiosity.
Mm.
which everybody has, but some people tend to exercise more than others. And so, in your opening quotation attributed to Abraham Lincoln, in order to go and speak to somebody I don't like, what do we need? Well, I need to be curious, I need to be open, but I need to be able to express that curiosity and that openness. And the way I do that is through asking good, thoughtful questions that allows somebody else to express themselves and to disclose more for our benefit and for theirs who they actually are. But I think, broadly speaking, the more we can do to allow inquiry, the more we will have better, more informed conversations, the more we will learn to understand each other. It's one of the really intriguing things, and I can only speak for the United Kingdom, for politicians, British politicians, and although I think this extends to other areas where good questions don't get answered. So good questions that are inviting politicians to tell us what they think or what is happening or what might happen. When those questions are not answered, then we tend to build up a sense that it's futile to ask good open questions. And so it's really quite a destructive process. What we need with inquiry is the reciprocation. If I ask you a good question, you feel like you want to respond to it, and that fuels the conversation. It fuels my preference for asking more and more open questions. And so we connect so much better.
Yeah, I like that really, really much. So one of the things I think I really want to help, the folks who are listening to this program here, right, and watching it, is to kind of identify, what does a inquiry, or what does an inquire voice sound like, right? So give us some example, right? If somebody's inquiring, what are we hearing from them?
Well, we might, for example, hear a simple invitation. You may be telling me about SOUNDWAVE, and I might say, that sounds interesting. Tell me more. So that simple invitation to elaborate further is an important dimension of inquiry. But you notice it's not really a question.
Yeah.
It's an invitation. Tell me more. But it is an inquiry because I'm wanting you to disclose more. I think more conventionally, we tend to associate inquiry with good open questions.
Yeah.
And this is the territory of the open question. If you're going to ask an open question, the chances are it's an inquiry-based question. And we use it in really important contexts. So, for example, a lot of people listening to this session will be running their own business. They'll be either working on strategies in their own company, or they might be consulting to their clients on strategy. Well, it's very difficult to form a strategy without really deep inquiry. There are a whole series of open questions which allow us to get to the nature of how we might compete effectively. So who are our competitors? How are our competitors performing? What products do we have? What services are we offering? So the voice of inquiry takes us upwards to explore. Okay, it is all about opening things up. So open questions and invitations tend to be the characteristic voice you will hear when you hear somebody inquiring, Kim Pong. At least that's what I think.
Well, I think it's you sound quite convincing to me. Yeah, I mean, as you were talking just now, right? I love the idea that the inquiry voice is about opening up the conversation, and I particularly love the way you describe it. That the inquiry voice is not so much as it is a question, but it is more an invitation. I just love that. It's because the inquire voice, based on what we have been doing in SOUNDWAVE, it essentially is the voice of engagement, isn't it? Right? I think when you use the inquire voice, people are engaged with you. People realize that you are actually paying attention to them. You're giving intention to them. And one of the things I've learned about the inquire voice is that of all, well, by the way, so the inquire voice is really within the the asking cluster, right? So within the asking cluster, there's inquiry, there's probe, there's diagnose, and then you also have the suggest cluster, and you also have the telling clusters here. Now, when I look at all the 9 different voices in the whole repertoire of Soundwave, one of the things I realized about the inquiry voice is that, within all the voices, it perhaps is the only voice that has this really strong sense of intellectual humility, right? That you just somehow you know believe that, hey, I perhaps do not know as much as I think I do. There's a certain sense of humility. There's a certain sense of that the intellectual curiosity and openness towards that, right? I mean, what do you think of that? I mean, I'm curious to know your thoughts on this idea here.
I think I'm in my own mind. I'm just spinning around the model and doing a little check-in on what the other voices might say. So, would it be, just to test that? Would it be possible to demonstrate humility if I were critiquing, for example, or demonstrate humility if I were advocating? It seems far less likely, particularly with the advocating voice. There's too much ego invested in that particular voice. But inquiry, I think you're right. I think that if you were to, because humility is very much in vogue, leaders are meant to be humble these days. Well, there's a whole set of important underlying dimensions to that. But in one way or another, people need to know whether you might be humble or are not. And to take a view that you're not in control, that you don't have the power, that you must give way to something which is perhaps bigger than yourself, can almost only lead you, as you say, Kim Pong, to ask questions. Let me ask questions. The only thing I can really do in this space, if I am genuinely humble, is to find out, to try and understand what I don't know myself, what other people might know. So I think that's right. I think that's a really interesting insight that you have, Kim Pong.
Cool. So I just want to take on to what you're saying, right? What do you think are the situations that prevents people from wanting to use the inquiry voice?
I think there are two things. I think there may be some situations, and we sort of discussed one of them, high command and control situations, very autocratic bosses who are not open themselves to being questioned. That's one dimension. The other dimension is I do think there are some people, but it's probably a small number, who genuinely are not that curious. So I coached somebody very recently, Kim Pong, who was quite a senior manager in an organization, and he was really struggling to use the voice of inquiry. And we explored why that might be the case, and I made a suggestion, which was that he tap into his natural curiosity. And I said that, and then he went very quiet for a moment and then said, "Do you know what my wife always tells me?" I said, "Well, no." He said, "Well, my wife always tells me that I lack curiosity." I said, well, do you? And he said, well, in a way, I'm very forgiving. And if somebody says something to me, I tend to take it at face value. I don't go back and explore it any further. So I think I haven't developed my sense of curiosity. Now, I actually refuse to believe that people come into this world with a lack of curiosity. I don't know how people can survive in the world without, or how, as a species, humankind would have survived without curiosity. So I think we all have it, but I think that for some people, there are social aspects of their upbringing, which means they just haven't relied on it and they haven't developed it that much. But of course, you can come at it from the other end. If you learn how to do something very simple, relatively simple, which is to ask good open questions, well, that will fuel your creativity. And then the two things can feed off each other.
Yeah. I mean, I love that story, and that is something that happens so frequently in the lives of many different people, across different situations, isn't it? I mean, I know, like, for example, back at work, right? When my folks, tell me certain things, in my mind, I'm registering what they're saying. I kind of know I know what they're saying, and I am sympathetic to what they're saying. I understand what they're getting at, and I go like, okay, thanks, right? And I just moved on. And then, a couple of days later, I would check in with those guys, and sometimes I feel that sometimes they'll tell me, "Hey, Pong, did you really hear what we told you?" Right? It's as if you're not listening to what we are saying. And honestly speaking, right, when they gave me the kind of feedback, I'm like, "What are you saying?" Right? I mean, I heard you. I knew exactly what you're saying. I registered, and I remembered, right? But for some strange reason, they just felt that they were not getting the sense or the feeling that I've paid attention to them or that I've heard them. And as I think back on all these multiple conversations, Kevin, one of the things I realized was sometimes the fact that sometimes our intentions or in our mind, we think we are hearing people and we are listening to people and we responded them with them the right way, but in reality, that is not their experience, right? And I learned that the voice of inquiry actually is a very powerful voice, because it's not just about that, the intellectual humility that we talked about just now. It's not just about being curious and being open, but it's more about giving attention to the people that we are talking to. And I realized that for me, because I'm such a boom, 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 bang, bang, bang kind of guy, which I'm moving really, really fast, right? Sometimes, to be able to kind of slow down, listen to the conversation, and ask some really, really good, inquiring questions, it's a really powerful engagement, experience or moment for people between me and them, and people between themselves here. And I really love that, right? Now, one of the things that I want to kind of segue into the next piece of the conversation here is this, right? When we talk a little bit about, so I'm going to read the definition of the inquiry voice here. The definition is to open exploratory questions in order to discover more, right? And my question here for you is this, right? What is the most visible impact that you can see in organizations, in teams, in relationships, when the voice of inquiry is used skillfully and appropriately?
Well, I think that's easy to answer, Kim Pong. I think it's ownership. I think what the voice of inquiry drives in organizations is ownership. So, people who are practice coaches will come across this very often. Person turns up with a problem, and the manager asks a series of good questions about the problem. And if the questions are good enough and the conversation involves the individual, will leave that conversation being clearer about the nature of the problem, being clearer about potential solutions, and being clearer about what their next step needs to be to address it. And I think it's possible to see a very direct and a very immediate impact in that direction. So it doesn't take long to achieve. I mean, there are many expensive ways of improving the performance of an organization, and there are a number of really inexpensive ways. And one really inexpensive way is to develop managers to inquire thoroughly, systematically with their people. And that will change the outcomes almost overnight. And it sounds very dramatic, but I think it is dramatic. I think the effect of consistent, well thought through inquiry will have a dramatic effect, particularly if the culture up to that point is much more directional. And it raises lots of questions about how you make this change stick. But putting that to one side for a moment, the mere immediate effect of inquiring of somebody creates connection, and it drives ownership.
Yeah.
And I think in our work in Soundwave, we've a lot of evidence to support that argument.
I really what you said just now about the inquiry voice seen in the behavior of managers, struck me. I think you talk about it being a really inexpensive way of engaging or changing organizational culture, right? And it's just by tweaking, it's just by getting people to ask great questions around the problems, around the opportunities that they have, isn't it? Very often, I think a lot of managers love to tell. I mean, I think we previously quoted Peter Senge on this, right? That managers advocate too much and ask too little, and in the process, deny themselves of fulfilling the dreams and the ideas that they want to do with people, right? And I really love that. Number one is the cost. Number two is just a simple tweak on the inquiry capability here. My question then is this, right? And I jotted it down here. How can we learn to ask great inquiring questions then? I mean, not everybody is intuitive and natural in asking, great inquiring questions. So for someone that says, look, I've seen the benefit of this. I really want to tap into this benefit here. What can they do to learn to inquire a whole lot better?
So I think an everyday opportunity is to listen to the radio, possibly watch television, but to listen to the radio and listen to really good interviewers or really good interviews, not so much politicians being interviewed or news media, but where people are interviewed about their lives. So interviews which are biography based. And what you tend to hear there is, amongst other things, is a very skillful use of the voice of inquiry. And you hear it used with, I've come up with a little phrase recently, which I refer to as hearsay, which is usually hearsay means gossip. But I think hearsay is a process of communication. I hear, you say. Okay, you say. That's essentially what's going on in a conversation. We should rename our conversation hearsay. And what you hear in these good in these good interviews is hearsay. A question is asked, somebody talks, a supplementary question is asked, the interviewee talks. Now, the only way to get the interviewee to continue to talk is to ask good open questions, because you're seeking disclosure. And that's the process of inquiring a conversation. So listen to good radio broadcasts, good interviews, and you'll hear very quickly what it sounds like. And then you can mimic it. And then beyond the point of mimicking it, you can practice it and incorporate it. So I think there are some simple ways of making these happen. What you have to be aware of and what you'll become tuned into is just how many interviews and how many conversations involve the leading question rather than the open question. Do you think that you were wrong to have blah, 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 blah? This is not helpful, because leading questions close down conversation rather than opening them up. And sometimes we might want to do that. But since we're talking about inquiry today, we don't want to do that. We want disclosure. We want things to open up. That's my tip.
Yeah, it's good. And the other thing is this, right? I mean, what should people be looking out for when they are practicing the inquire voice, right?
So I think, again, there are a couple of things. Firstly, they should be checking in with themselves that their questions are genuinely inquiry-based questions, in the sense that I'm asking the question because I actually don't know the answer. I've emptied my mind of a preconception as to what the answer is, and I'm asking the question not because I want to confirm I was right, not because I want to trick the person, but because I have a genuine interest in wanting to know what they think or what they believe. So that's the first thing, check in with themselves. I think the second thing then is to make sure that the person is asking the question. Answering the question, forgive me, because there is a sensitivity here. Sometimes people are not that accustomed to being on the receiving end of 2 or 3 open questions. It's not the way everyday conversation works. We tend to do things like exchange views, tell each other stories about our lives. We tend to get asked lots of questions either when the police are interviewing us or when we're sitting in front of a coach. So the other thing to do is to check in that my questions are landing, that the person seems to be receptive and responsive to the fact that I've now asked 3 open questions in a row in the space of a couple of minutes. It's not necessarily a normal thing to do in everyday circumstances. And certainly in organizational life, it's not a normal thing to do at all.
No. Yeah, and I think for me, right? I mean, Kevin, when I was learning how to use my inquire voice even better, I think one of the greatest challenges for me, I'm not sure whether it is for you, because you're such a natural inquirer for yourself, right? But for me, when I was going through the practice of learning my inquire voice, one of the things I really had to do was to learn how to ask that question and shut up, right? And just wait for the answer. Because
Yeah.
it's like so often after I ask the question, I attempt to want to help people to answer the question. So to me,
I think that's great. Somebody told me a great story. A friend of mine who was going through a hard time and was in therapy, and he turned up to see his therapist
mm,
and sat down, and they sat there in silence for a few seconds, and my friend didn't want to speak,
mm,
and the therapist remained quiet, and 59 minutes into the hour session, nobody had spoken, and I'm not quite sure what happened at the end, but I've always remembered the story because what I think it showed is how serious the therapist was
mm,
in allowing the individual space to disclose what they wanted to disclose or not to disclose
mm,
what they didn't want to disclose. And it never occurred to me before that it might be possible to remain silent for much more than about 10 seconds.
yeah.
And after I heard that story, I thought, well, this is really interesting. We can put this into effect. What happens if I just say nothing
Mm,
and see what. Now, actually, what we do know is that puts enormous pressure on the other person to speak. So a surefire way of getting other people to disclose something is not to say anything once you've asked your question.
yeah. You know what?
Yeah.
I had a similar story here, Kevin, and that happened to me. I think probably about 7 years ago. And I was coaching some person from a client of mine from Hong Kong, right? And I asked a question, and all of a sudden, on the other side of the line, she became quiet, right? And I literally was like, "Gosh, is she still there? Did we just break off connection?" And the wait was almost for a full 90 seconds, right? Now that's a really, really long time. If you had a
Yeah.
camera trained on me that particular day, I'm literally tearing my fingers out of my nails here, right? Or tearing my nails out of my fingers here, right? I'm like, grabbing onto my chest. Come on, say something, man, damn it, say something, right? And eventually she said something, and her response was not a word. Her response was a sniff, right? And I realized that something emotional just took place, and she couldn't bring herself to bear to articulate those words immediately, and it took a while for her to read to collect her thoughts, get her emotion, get a what do you call it, disposition back in order before she can actually share. And that was a very powerful moment for me, right? uh, so right now what I'd like to do, Kevin, is to kind of bring it to a different level of discussion here. We've been talking a lot about the power, the impact, and the effect of the inquire voice here. Now we talk a lot about the whole idea of accentuating our voices in sound wave here, right? So it doesn't matter whether you are, challenge, critique, correct, articulate, advise, inquire, probe, or whatever, right? That we actually have that ability subconsciously or even intentionally to accentuate our voice. So, share with me, right? What do you think happens when we actually accentuate our inquire voice, and how would people experience it when you are, inquiring, via the accentuated, megaphone here?
Yeah, it's a good question. We tend to characterize too much inquiry as interrogation.
Hmm.
And so, in a sense, the way to think of the accentuated version of the voice is that it's a qualitative difference. It's a bit like when we boil a kettle. Yeah, we put water in the kettle, but it comes out as steam. It's a different format,
Hmm.
and, and the same happens when we move from, in this case, inquiry to interrogation. Interrogation is too much of inquiry,
Hmm.
but its form, it ends up being understood as something quite different
Mm-hmm.
from the source. So interrogation might happen because I just ask too many questions too quickly,
Mm-hmm.
without you've given our conversation a moment ago about giving people space and allowing them to think and respond. That's not what happens when we're inquiring too much.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and actually what we do is we put people on the back foot.
Mm-hmm.
They feel overwhelmed by what's coming at them, and the chances are they will defend themselves because they, at some level, feel under attack. The way in which most people defend themselves in interrogation is not to say anything, or to say as little as they can. So it defeats the entire process. We're looking to open things up. What have we done? We've closed everything back down again, and that's not the intention. Now, I'm not certain that people accentuate inquiry too much. There are some people who do. I think the opposite is more the case, Kim Pong. I don't know if it's your experience, but I think the issue with inquiry is more to do that there isn't enough of it rather than too much. And so what we have is the passive version. And that, in a sense, is, and we talk about that as people are incurious, curiously enough, having spoken about that. So I'm not showing the necessary curiosity about the issue or about the person to continue to inquire in the way that I know is productive. And I think you've heard me say I'm sort of increasingly of the view that it's the absence of voice which is probably more significant than the accentuation or overuse of voice. People's failure to inquire when inquiry is needed serves to close things down, or at least very least it doesn't open up the space for good conversation, because having not inquired, you don't have the material with which to inquire about.
Yeah, when you're saying that, it just reminded me of something that I often share with people in the workshops that I run using SOUNDWAVE here in this part of the world in Asia. And I often tell people, when voice is needed but silence prevails, bad things happen, right? So it's true, right? I mean, it's like we sometimes that voice is needed, but for some strange reason, right, we are not using that or whatever. And just now when you're talking about the inquiry voice, about the interrogation aspects of it, I was laughing because it just reminded me of my experience with my wife, because there was a certain period of time when she'll be telling me something and I'll be asking question, and I'll be asking questions, and all of a sudden, over the course of the question, I realized that she became quieter and quieter and quieter, and she just ignored me with all the questions, right? And then, at one time I asked her, "Hey, honey, why do you do that to me, right? Why did you suddenly keep quiet? We're having a great conversation, aren't we?" And then she told me, "Hey, Pong, all I wanted you is to listen, not to interrogate me, right?" So that's the real life experience that happens to me here. But what I want to say is just, right, the idea of using a voice skillfully does have its accompanying different use or different ways of using it, and that's to accentuate it or to actually make it passive, right? So I want to talk a little bit about the accentuation here, Kevin. What do you think, in your experience in coaching, training people all over the world, are the triggers for people to accentuate the inquiry voice?
So I think one of them is frustration. So perhaps somebody is wanting to engage somebody and find out more, and that person's not forthcoming. And so rather than back off and provide space and maybe ask a simple question about, I noticed, or a statement, I noticed you're not responding to my questions, can you tell me what's happening? Okay. Instead of doing that, the frustration gets hold of the person and they just push on with it. So I think one of the causes of all accentuation, but particularly with respect to inquiry, is frustration. I think another is urgency. So somebody has a need to find out about something quickly, and they're relying on the other person to give them the information or the ideas or the possibilities, and they are not as forthcoming, or they're not quite getting what they think they want, and then the process becomes corrupted.
Mm-hmm.
And so the quality of the inquiry reduces, and that closes down the conversation, even though the frequency of the questions might increase.
Yeah.
So I think those are two reasons: a sense of urgency
Mm-hmm.
and a sense of frustration may well cause somebody to overuse a voice.
I love that. So I like to say, look, sometimes a potential trigger for the inquiry voice to go into accentuation is directional bias, right? It's like we want the conversation to go a certain direction, and for whatever reason, people kind of stay around that, and we're like asking all kinds of crazy questions, get people to go from here to there, and every time they don't do that, we just keep pressing on, and ask more and more and more, right? Love that, the triggers. Now I want to go into the passive voice right now, Kevin. I guess what are the conditions that people are in, right, that causes them to intentionally not use that particular voice, or to ignore even, right, that particular voice in their conversations with people around them?
I think the fundamental one will be a lack of felt safety. That people are at some level fearful about asking the questions that they want to ask. Now that obviously has some clear resonance in organizational life. I may not want to inquire in this forum because the question I have could reveal things that I don't necessarily want everybody to hear. Or I have the confidence in my boss doesn't have the confidence in me. So I think on balance, it's better that I don't ask. So I've got to feel a level of security or safety about the nature of my relationships, particularly at work, to be able to do that. And it's probably the same in some family situation, particularly where there are tensions. I really want to ask this question, but there'll be hell to pay if I do, so I'm not going to do it. I'll wait my time. And that's not a bad strategy, wait until the moment is right. But people can't wait for the moment to be right all the time. I mean, sometimes there are consequences of asking good questions at a particular point in time, because failure to ask the question, failure to get disclosure is going to cause a bigger problem down the road.
Yeah, I mean,
so I think security is a fundamental thing. Sorry, Kim Pong.
Yeah, that's fine. I really resonate very deeply with this whole idea of the lack of safety in using the inquire voice, right? I mean, this happens. I mean, you're right. It happens in our workplaces. It happens in our families. It happens in our communities, isn't it? The next question I want to ask in line with this whole idea of accentuation and passive voices here, Kevin, is this: are there any instances where people are intentionally accentuated and is actually beneficial, to them in the conversations that they have?
Yeah, this is an interesting point. I think that in the same way that there are situations in which it might be better not to inquire. Okay, we talked about that a moment ago, maybe insensitive. Maybe it would be insensitive to do so.
Yep.
Similarly, there are situations where occasionally, it might be worth accentuating. So, excuse me, a good example would be, I really need disclosure. I really need to understand what is going on for you. And whilst ordinarily I might give you lots of space, I can't afford to do that just now. You need to tell me, and I'm going to continue to ask. Okay. Now, I don't think those occasions are common, but I think what's interesting is we have the ability, a natural given ability, to use our voice in that way. There must be an evolutionary reason why it's helpful to have that voice. Otherwise, we wouldn't have it.
Yeah.
Okay, it exists. So what do we use it for? We know if we use it all of the time, it will corrupt our relationships, worsen our relationships. But we have the potential. So when is the right time to use it? So I think the example I've given is one example. But the key thing about the accentuated voices is that the infrequency of their use is what makes them powerful. Okay, so for me to inquire well is good. for me not to interrogate is also good.
Mm.
But when I do interrogate, the person on the receiving end is going to understand there's something going on here.
Mm-hmm.
There's some reason why this normally well-measured person is coming at me quite furiously.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think human beings are quite attuned to hear accentuated voices.
Mm.
So I think if somebody interrogates, we hear it. If somebody patronizes, we hear it. If somebody attacks, we hear it. Okay, we are really tuned in to hearing those, and so they stand out. And often if we know somebody who has a tendency to, say, interrogate, it characterizes them and we talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
I think in Soundwave, whilst it's good to know about the accentuated voices and we want to be able to understand their impact, it's actually much more helpful to the run-of-the-mill everyday conversations and quality of dialogue to understand what inquiry is and to do inquiry well, rather than to obsess, and I know we're not obsessing, but rather to obsess with the accentuated or the passive version. What Soundwave is about is trying to get the 9 voices working at a really skillful, really sensitive level, and to have an understanding that they're tripping up into accentuated or they're falling back into passive is broadly not helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Although maybe the odd occasion where it's useful.
Yeah, sure. I think that is brilliant, because what you're really trying to get, what we are trying to get everybody to do here, right? Essentially, is to be really skillful, not just in a few voices, but to be able to be skillful in all the repertoire of the 9 voices. And
Right.
we always say here at Soundwave, right? Is to get people to shift the dialogue, change the conversation, right, and shape that outcome or the culture that they want. I want to kind of finish off, with a few more questions, and then, I think we're all wrapped up for the voice of inquiry here. Now,
Sure.
we often in Soundwave we talk about, the persona of the voice, the metaphor that represents the voice. So in this instance, for the voice of inquiry, right? What do you think is a good representation for a persona for inquirer, and what do you think is a good metaphor to describe, the inquirer voice?
So personas, I think there are a few. Coach is a classic example, and a lot of people listening into this will make that association. I think also possibly explorer. So somebody who is wanting to find out about the world. We've got into the jungle and we're looking around at what is there, and we're asking good questions about why does it exist. Philosopher, good philosopher. So what is the meaning of life? That's a perfect question for inquiry. And then in terms of a metaphor, well, I think one of your favorites, Kim Pong, is the one I would mention, which is a balloon ride. So I imagine a balloon ride at several hundred feet above the ground, which gives you perspective.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think inquiry it's a word we've not used so far, but an important one. I think what inquiry is doing, it's trying to give you breadth of perspective, and that's what it achieves.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. I love that. I love this. It somehow makes what we do becomes earthy. That it's just something that you can hold on, you can grab, right? I love that very much. So Kevin, one final question and then we wrap up, right? So what is one great advice that you can give, to our folks out there, right? To want to be able to use the inquirer voice skillfully for great conversations with people?
I think you said one, but maybe 2 thoughts. The first one is so check it out. Check out, is inquiry one of your preferred voices? You can do that. I'm sure you have a few words to say about that, Kim Pong. The other thing is, just go and give it a go. See what happens when you practice asking open questions, even in your family setting. I often have people say to me, I went home, Kevin, after you ran this workshop, and I spent some time with my teenage children, and we actually had a reasonably constructive conversation for the first time in ages, because I asked them some questions and I just listened, and it seemed to have a bit of an impact. Fingers crossed. But the art is go and give it a go. Go and practice. You can't really go terribly wrong with this. And certainly attempting to inquire rather than telling will get you many more brownie points.
I cannot help but totally agree with that last advice here. So with that, Kevin, thank you very much. I think it's time. And
Thank you, Kim.
oh, you're welcome, right? And we're going to end this session here. So before we go, for all of you who's listening and tuning into this channel here, please remember to subscribe to the channel if you want to continually, be receiving the episodes here. And go ahead, click on the bell here if you want us to send you notification every time we set up a new episode here. And for those of you who are stumbling onto this channel here and they go like, my gosh, I wasn't prepared to come here, but this is so interesting. How do I find out my voices? Well, you can go ahead and click on this QR code here, and it'll bring you to the SOUNDWAVE website that will give you a lead through on doing an assessment called the Brilliance 3 that will showcase for you your top 3 voices here. And last but not least, any information regarding SOUNDWAVE, if you're gonna be, if you're looking for accreditation, if you're looking, to do the assessment, go ahead, check out all the links that we are providing for you in the description box. And with that, once again, we have finished episode 2 of of the voices here. And the next episode, we'll be talking about the probe and the diagnosed voice here. So with that, have a great great time serving each other one voice at a time. Go ahead and shift the dialogue, change the conversation, and shape the culture and outcomes that we want. So with that, see you guys. Kevin, once again, take care of yourself. Have a nice cup of tea and have a great day. All right, take care. Bye bye.
Thanks, Kim Pong. Bye bye.